Hi everyone. So today I'm doing a study into British Israelism, its origins and its agendas. This is part one of probably a series of maybe 3 videos. Okay, so I just wanted to look at British Israelism. So British Israelism, also called Anglo-Israelism, is a pseudo-historical belief that people of Great Britain are genetically, racially, and linguistically the direct descendants of the 10 lost tribes of ancient Israel. With roots in the 16th century, British Israelism was inspired by several 19th century English writings such as John Wilson's 1840 Our Israelitish Origin. From the 1870s onwards, numerous independent British Israelite organizations were set up through the British Empire as well as the United States. As of the early 21st century, a number of these organizations are still active. In the United States, the idea gave rise to the Christian identity movement. It says here, according to Brackney 2012 and Fine 2015, the French Huguenot magistrate M.E. Lawyers, the 10 Lost Tribes, published in 1590, provided one of the earliest expressions of the belief that the Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Scandinavian, Germanic, and associated peoples are the direct descendants of the Old Testament Israelites. Anglo-Israelism has also been attributed to King James VI and I, 1666 to 1625, who is reported to have believed he was the king of Israel. I still think they do think they're the king of Israel in the world. There's something in the Talmud that actually tells them that they are. I can't remember the verse, but it's in there. Adrian van Schreck, 1560 and 1621, who influenced Henry Spelman and John Sadler, there's some interesting surnames, wrote in the early 17th century about his ideas on the origins of the Celtic and Saxon peoples. In 1649, Sadler published Rights of the Kingdom, which argues for an Israelite genealogy for the British people. So my main intention here today is to see how this agenda has been used to basically establish the modern state of Israel. And in the early 20th century, this British Israeli movement was supported by Cecil Rhodes. And we know that Cecil Rhodes was in with the Disraeli family. And there seems to be some agenda behind this British Israeli movement to help promote the idea that the Western nations were the lost 10 tribes and that the Jewish people of today were actually the tribe of Judah, and that the story of Ezekiel's 2 sticks being reunited was actually happening in modern days in the early 20th century in the establishment of the state of Israel. When we know that what happened was when Jesus came, the lost tribes were united by the apostles, being the Greeks, the Jew and the Greek. That was the 2 kingdoms being united, the north and the south kingdom of Israel, back when the apostles were preaching to the 144,000 of the lost tribes. So the 144,000 being the remnant of the lost sheep of Israel. And when we consider that parable, Israel itself, before the fall of Judea and before Judea was cut off as a nation, which Jesus prophesied, was being gathered. And it was metaphorically gathered over time, and Jesus came to collect those last few remnant or lost sheep that were to be added to the flock. And they were the 12,000 out of each tribe of Israel, who was sealed in Revelation, and then the tribulation began. So Adrian van Schreck, Lord of Rhode. This is interesting. I mean, we have this Rhode name again popping up. It just keeps popping up everywhere. Names related to Rhode. Was a Flemish office holder and humanist, Renaissance humanism, is a worldview centered on the nature and importance of humanity that emerged from the study of classical antiquities. The country of Flanders was one of the most powerful political entities in the medieval Low Countries, located on the North Sea coast of modern-day Belgium and northeast France. So he was known for his historical and linguistic work. He is also known by his Latin name, Adrianus Schreckius. Adrian van Schreck was born in Brugge. After his earliest education in the native city, he attended the University of Paris to study philosophy and law. There he came into contact with famous people such as the French statesman and councillor of the Kingdom of Navarre. And this particular region keeps popping up again also. Navarre is where the Exilarch settled. Henry de Mesmes and Francois Pithou. So Francois Pithou was a French lawyer and author. The de Mesmes family is an old family from the province of Bern. It has given France many great clerks of the state. Originally from Bern, the family goes back to Amanu de Mesmes, described as a knight, Miles in Latin. In a donation in 1219, he was the father of Raymond and the grandfather of Pierre de Mesmes, knight and lord of Mesmes, cited as being at the head of the nobility of his bailiwick in 1343. Guillaume de Mesmes is known as the first chaplain of King St. Louis. As we learn from an ancient Valium manuscript in which we read these words, this book was given to King St. Louis at the end of his days to Monsieur Guillaume de Mesmes, his first chaplain. This psalter then passed to the kings of England before returning to the family of Mesmes. In his spare time, he devoted himself to historical research, supported by a network of humanist scholars in the Habsburg Netherlands and the Dutch Republic that included Nicholas Cromwell, Ursius Prutinus, and Rose de Rijks. Schreck's historical works include the history of Ypres and the prehistory of Europe. According to this website, Witness to the Israelite Origin of the Nordic, Germanic, and Anglo-Saxon People, the early witnesses to this information was Adrian van der Schreck, Flemish language researcher. The subtitle of an old Flemish book by Adrian van der Schreck, published in 1614 in Ypern, said that the Netherlands with the Gauls and Germans together in the earliest times were called Celts, who are come out of the Hebrews. And here we have Henry Spelman, English antiquity, noted for his detailed collection of medieval records, in particular of church councils. According to the illustrious Danish 18th century historian Peter Frederick Schum, Henry Spelman believed that the Danes, Norwegians, and Goths were Hebrews, and that the Danes were the Israelite tribe of Dan. So it says here the earliest recorded expression, according to Brackney 2012 and Fine of 2015, the French Huguenot magistrate M. Le Lawyer's 10 Lost Tribes, published in 1590, provided one of the earliest expressions of the belief that the Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Scandinavian, and Germanic and associated peoples are the direct descendants of the Old Testament Israelites. Anglo-Israelism has also been attributed to King James VI and I, who believed he was the king of Israel. Adrian van Schreck, 1560 to 1621, who influenced Henry Spelman, and John Sadler wrote in the early 17th century about his ideas on the origin of the Celtic and Saxon peoples. In 1649, Sadler published The Rights of the Kingdom, which he argues for an Israelite genealogy for the British people. Now, it's known that the Huguenots were potentially made up of converso Sephardi Jews, and the Huguenots are people who belong to the French Reformed Church, who in 1685 were given the choice of converting to Roman Catholicism or leaving France. History indicates about 800,000 chose to stay in France and became Catholic. 200,000 are thought to have fled France, mostly through Switzerland and then into Germany, England, Ireland, and America. There was a time when the Huguenots maintained their culture outside of France As the centuries have passed, awareness of Huguenot ancestry has faded away. If you have Huguenot ancestry, there is a good chance you have Sephardic Jewish ancestry. The reason is pretty simple. Most French Reformed folks lived in southern and southwestern France. This territory shares a border with Spain. When the Spanish Jews were given 3 months to convert to Catholicism or leave Spain in 1492, many hopped the border into France. The Jews of Spain that did not convert did not find conversion an effective strategy. Despite becoming Catholic, anti-Semitism continued. In 1492, it was dangerous to become a converted Jew in Spain. The Holy Inquisition, which was anything but holy, made the life of converted Spanish Jews a misery. This led to the second wave of Spanish Jews or Sephardic Jews migration out of Spain. In this case, the people left as conversos, Jews that had converted to Catholicism. Like their relatives before them, many conversos hopped the border and moved to France. The conversos once in France took several paths. Some remained Catholic, some returned to Judaism, and some joined the French Reformed Church or Huguenots. And you can see this website here, hiddenjewishancestry.com, for that information. Here from this Armstrong Institute article, it says that the French Huguenot magistrate M. Leloyer described an Israelite genealogy for the British in his 1590 book, The 10 Lost Tribes, and many pilgrims married into Huguenot families. The Huguenots were French Protestants with links to the medieval Waldensians. So already here we have Henry Spelman. Who was Henry Spelman? Was an English antiquary noted for his detailed collections of medieval records, in particular the Church Council. Now, were these records true? I'm not saying that they're not true. What I'm saying is that this agenda has been manipulated for a reason, for these people who had an agenda to establish this state of Israel. So we've got Henry Spelman, Congham, Norfolk, the eldest son of Henry Spelman of Congham, and the grandson of Sir John Spelman. He graduated from Trinity College, Cambridge, founded by Henry VIII, but he married Eleanor, daughter of John Lestrange. It's interesting, that's a Harry Potter surname, of Sedgeford, Norfolk. His nephew, also named Henry Spelman, became a notable translator in America. Sir John Spelman was an English judge from Norfolk, noted for his composition of law reports. It says his Spelman ancestors originated in Hampshire, where before 1272 they had the manor of Brockenhurst. John Sadler was an English lawyer, academic, member of Parliament, town clerk of London, Hebraist, Neoplatonist, millenarian thinker, private secretary to Oliver Cromwell. So there's someone who's sort of related to this kind of Puritan movement. And as I've traced in my other videos, the Puritan movement actually traces back to, believe it or not, the Sabbatean Frankists. And so the starting of the Puritan movement was in some way a Hegelian opposite to the Frankists, who were redemption through sin. The Puritan movement was kind of like the Opus Dei, where it was, I guess, redemption through purity. And this is what I find with a lot of these different movements that we take on. We take on these identities, and all of them at some level have a Hegelian equivalent. You know, it's these two-sided left and right arguments that force us into a decision to be made when realistically we shouldn't be choosing either of them. So John Sadler was master of Magdalene College, Cambridge. It's a Benedictine hostel. And he married the daughter of Dorset MP John Trenchard, and his sister Anne married John Harvard. So this is John Harvard of Harvard University in America. So was an English Puritan minister in colonial New England whose deathbed bequest to the Gole or College College, founded 2 years earlier by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was so gratefully received that the colony consequently ordered that the college agreed upon formally to be built at Cambridge shall be called Harvard College. But yeah, like these early Puritan ministers and that were tied into pseudo-Jewish people, and as I said, the Puritan movement. Some of my videos on romantic period of how the Puritan movement goes back to the Sabbatean Frankists. So John Sadler was a well-known London lawyer and constitutional theorist and a good friend of Oliver Cromwell. Okay, so anyone who's a good friend of Oliver Cromwell, we know that he was part of this sort of Puritan Reformation movement. So his political thoughts, he wrote The Rights of the Kingdom, a founding document of British Israelitism. Tudor Parfit calls it one of the first invented expressions of an invented Israelite genealogy for the British. This was not, however, its overt purpose. Glenn Burgess calls it an historical defense of the regicide. Maurice Vile writes, Sadler's views of the executive function was, as we have seen, not our modern one, but in other respects his grasp of the principles of the doctrine of the separation of powers was clear. So here we have Cromwell and the Jews. The Jews were expelled from England in 1290 in the reign of Edward I. Their readmission in 1656 under the Cromwellian Protectorate is interpreted by some as evidence of Cromwell's toleration and compassion. This is open to challenge on several points. Although the Jewish community at the end of the 19th century highlighted the anniversary and linked it particularly to the mission of an Amsterdam-based rabbi, Manasseh ben Israel, there is evidence of an established Jewish community in London before 1655. Fearful of persecution, they did not declare their identity, living as Spanish merchants. Whilst their commercial affairs were public, their religion was private. So yeah, Cromwell's the one who let the Jews back into England. I'll just do a quick dive into the Puritans. It says here, from 1649 to 1660, Puritans in the Commonwealth of England were allied to the state power held by the military regime headed by Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell. So it says, with the abolition of the Act of Uniformity, even the pretense of religious uniformity broke down. Thus, while the Presbyterians were dominant, at least theoretically, within the established church, those who opposed Presbyterianism were in fact free to start conducting themselves in the way they wanted. Separatists who had previously organized themselves underground were able to worship openly. For example, as early as 1616, the first English Baptists had organized themselves in secret under the leadership of Henry Jacob. Well, hello, Jacob, interesting surname. Was an English clergyman of Calvinist views who founded the first true congregational church in England associated with the Brownists. He asserted the autonomy of the church and advocated for ecclesiastical government without bishops. His stance challenged the hierarchy of the Church of England and led to his imprisonment and exile. We also have John Lothrop. So these are all the early leaders of the United States. Lothrop was a strong proponent of the separation of church and state. This idea eventually became the mainstream view of the people in the United States of America because of the effort of Lothrop and others. Lothrop influenced the culture of New England and through that upon the rest of the country. He has had many notable descendants, including at least 6 U.S. presidents, as well as many other prominent governors, government leaders, leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, and business people. Here's a Harry Potter turn. The Muggletonians, named after Ludwig Muggleton, were a small Protestant Christian movement which began in 1651 when 2 London tailors announced they were the last prophets foretold in the biblical book of Revelation. The group grew out of the Ranters and in opposition to Quakers. So tell me that J.K. Rowling actually wrote Harry Potter or didn't know about all these particular families. We already have Lestrange as a surname. I mean, is the Harry Potter book series some kind of insight into Protestants being indoctrinated or being included into the magic world of the occult. Henry Jesse was one of the many English dissenters. He was a founding member of the Puritan religious sects, the Jacobites. So the Jacobite ideology originated with James VI and First, so King James of the King James Bible, who in 1603 became the first monarch to rule all three kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Its basis was divine right. So we know his thoughts on divine right, which he believes that he was a demigod and he had God's right to rule and own all of us, which ties into this King of Israel theology from the Talmud, which claimed his authority came from God and the crown's descent by indefeasible hereditary right. James and his supporters emphasized his right to the throne by blood to forestall controversy over his appointment by Elizabeth I as her successor. His concept of personal rule eliminated the need for parliaments and required political and religious union. Concepts widely unpopular in three kingdoms, but especially England. The principle of divine right also clashes with Catholic allegiance to the Pope and with Protestant nonconformists, since both argued there was an authority above the king. The 17th century believed that true religion and good government were one and the same, meant disputes in one area fed into another, while millennialism and belief in imminence of the second coming meant many Protestants viewed such issues as urgent and real. This division between Rome and the Protestant Church may be a bit more complicated than we are led to believe. It could be some infighting from these specific groups who declare that they are the king of Israel, and they may have been fighting over who was the lineage to rule the world. So we have the Pope saying on one side that he was the king, and we have the kings on the throne of England who say they are of the lineage of the Exilarch and King David and that they deserve the right to rule. Jesse was considered a Hebrew and rabbinical scholar. His active philo-Semitism had led him to be described as among Israel's greatest 17th century benefactors. So he's a benefactor for Israel. So here we have Cromwell letting the Jews back into England. We have these people starting the Puritan movement. Philo-Semitism, also called Judophilia, is defense, love, or admiration of Jews and Judaism. Such attitudes can be found in the Western cultures across the centuries. The term originated in the 19th century by self-described German anti-Semites to describe their non-Jewish opponents. So in this internet archive book, Rights of the Kingdom or Customs of Our Ancestors touching the duty, power, election, or succession of our kings and parliaments, our true liberty, due allegiance, 3 estates, the legislative power original. Down here it has some information on John Sadler, 1615 to 1674, political theorist and reformer, Hebrew scholar. Okay, so I'm just pointing out some kind of red flags here. Millenarian and Cambridge Platonist. So all of these sort of esoteric Kabbalistic groups all loved Plato and Greek philosophy. So millenarianism is the belief by a religious, social, or political group or movement in coming fundamental transformation of society. So this guy was into transforming society that was focused towards British Israelism, after which all things will be changed. Millenarianism exists in various cultures and religions worldwide with various interpretations of what constitutes transformation. Now, clearly his ideals of transformation weren't biblical because he was a Platonist. Refer to 1000. They both derive from the Christian tradition. Neither term strictly refers to 1000. In modern 1963 academic usage. Millenarianism often refers to a specific type of Christian millenarianism and is sometimes referred to as Chiliasm from the New Testament use of the Greek chilia, thousand, or kilia. The term millenarianism and millenarianism are sometimes used interchangeably, as in the Oxford Handbook of Millenarianism. The application of an apocalyptic timetable to the changing of the world has happened in many cultures and religions, continues to this day, and is not relegated to sects of major world religions, both Abrahamic and non-Abrahamic. Increasingly, the study of apocalyptic new religious movements, millenarianism, is used to refer to a more cataclysmic and destructive arrival of a utopian period as compared to millenarianism, which is often used to denote a more peaceful arrival and is closely associated with a 1,000-year utopia. So we've got to be careful here, because we know that the Bible talks about 1,000-year rule and reign of Christ. I believe that's in the spiritual, and it's 1,000 years of people learning and growing Christianity, not necessarily a real life physical reign of Christ on earth. But as in my last video on the dragon, we know that this golden era or utopian period is also associated with the Kabbalah and the Talmud and the worship of Saturn, going back to a golden era. And it's all linked to an occult Blavatsky type belief on humanity that is Kabbalistic. Also, if you are following this millennialism, it would appear to me that it's actually a futurist doctrine, because if we believe that we are in the little season now, even way back in the late 1600s, believing that the millennium was still coming, and preaching a doctrine that it's yet to come is futurism. He was a close friend and correspondent of both Milton. So we know Milton's Paradise Lost, which preaches a doctrine of Satan and hell, and a Kabbalistic version of the underworld, and not a biblical understanding of hell or Satan. So I've talked about this in other videos, how this book, Paradise Lost, has a lot of false doctrine in it, and it is a Platonist view, a Kabbalistic view. Paradise Lost is an epic poem by John Milton, first published in 1667, that explores the biblical story of the fall of man, focusing on the rebellion of Satan and the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The poem is renowned for its themes of free will, disobedience, and the nature of good and evil. As Milton seeks to justify the ways of God to men, it is considered one of the greatest works in English language and has had a profound influence on literature and theology. So that's from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So there was a lot of false doctrine and Kabbalistic Talmudic doctrine pushed through John Milton's Paradise Lost. And he was friends with Samuel Hartlib, and an ally and promoter of Manasseh ben Israel, sharing Oliver Cromwell's commitment to the readmission and the enfranchisement of Jews to mid-17th century Britain. So this guy had an agenda. This is John Sadler. So with a surname like Sadler, and I can't find any background family history on him, I would say he was probably related somewhere to the rabbinical class. I mean, he's a Hebrew scholar. He is linked to all these people. So Samuel Hartlib, can't find an actual rabbinic background on this man either, or maybe he could have been related to Exilarchs, but Samuel Hartlib was a Polish-born English educational and agricultural reformer of German-Polish origin. So I mean, Hartlib, and he has some suspect red flags as well, because he settled and married in England. He was a son of George Hartlib, a Polish person, so lots of the rabbi class in Poland, and Elizabeth Langton. a daughter of a rich English merchant. So always these merchants involved in rich merchants. Hartlib was a noted promoter and writer in fields that included science, medicine, agriculture, politics, and education. He was a contemporary of Robert Boyle, whom he knew well, and a neighbour of Samuel Pepys in Axe Yard, London, in the early 1660s. He studied briefly at University of Cambridge upon arriving in England. So Hartlib was born in Alblag, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His mother was the daughter of a rich English merchant in Danzig. His father was a Polish refugee merchant. So he was of the family of Polish merchants, and his wife was of a family of English merchants. Now, why am I picking on family? Like basically people's philosophies come from their upbringing and their family and their religious backgrounds in that sense. So, if he has an agenda to push a certain theory into the public conscience, then it will be coming from an inherited family doctrine. So what exactly is the Hartlib Circle? So the Hartlib Circle was a correspondence network set up in Western and Central Europe by Samuel Hartlib, an intelligencer. So a bringer of intelligence, a spy or informant. So Samuel Hartlib, this intelligencer, based in London, and his associates in the period of 1630 to 1660. Hartlib worked closely with John Drury, an itinerant figure who worked to bring Protestants together. So J.T. Young writes, at its nexus, it was an association of personal friends. Hartlib and Drury were the two key figures. Communists, despite their best efforts, always remained a cause they were supporting rather than a fellow coordinator. Around them were Huguenot, Hack, Powell, Maurian, Release, Houghton, and Apuleius, later to be joined by Sadler, Culpeper, Worsley, Boyle, and Clodius. So Robert Boyle, Anglo-Irish natural philosopher chemist. So his famous Clodius was the son-in-law of Hartlib, a physician and mystical chemist of German extraction. So already we have this group of people that start the origin of the British Israelite movement, and none of them are these noble cults that any of the people that follow this movement imagine them to be. I started to look into this movement, and it has completely changed my concept on the whole agenda behind British European Israelitism. Again, I'm not disputing that the people of Europe weren't descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. As I've stated, though, in my previous videos, now my belief is that it doesn't matter because Israel was completely cut off. Just like everybody else on earth has been cut off, we are men of the flesh, and the flesh does not inherit the kingdom of God. We have to enter through Jesus. Johannes Rulicus was a German Protestant minister. Johann Morian was a German alchemist and early chemist. Theodor Hack was a German Calvinist scholar. And John Amos Comenius was a Czech philosopher, pedagogue, and theologian. So John Drury was his main component in the Hartlib Circle, and he was a Scottish Calvinist minister and an intellectual of the English Civil War period. He made efforts to reunite the Calvinist and Lutheran wings of Protestantism, hoping to succeed when he moved to Kassel in 1661, but he did not accomplish this. He was also a preacher, pamphleteer, and writer. He was the fourth son of the exiled Presbyterian minister Robert Drury. John was brought up in the Netherlands. So here we have the Netherlands again. And there seems to be a strong connection with the Netherlands at Leiden. Attending the university there, he was in Cologne at the Walloon Church in 1624 to 26 and subsequently at Elblad. He was a close associate of Samuel Hartlib, a native of Elblad, whom he met there and shared his interest in education. According to Richard Popkin, another key influence was Joseph Mead. So Joseph Mead was an English scholar with a wide range of interests. He was educated at Christ's College, Cambridge, where he became a fellow in 1613. He is now remembered as a biblical scholar. He was also a naturalist, Egyptologist. He was a Hebraist and became a lecturer of Greek. So Drury met Manasseh ben Israel in 1644 and heard from him an account of Antonio de Montesino's alleged discovery of the 10 tribes in America. Antonio de Montesino, also known as Aaron Levy or Aaron Ha-Levy, was a Portuguese traveller and converso Sephardic Jew who in 1644 persuaded Manasseh ben Israel, a rabbi of Amsterdam, here's Amsterdam again, that he had found one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel living in the jungles of Quito province. That is the Pichincha province of Ecuador. This supposed discovery gave a new impulse to Manasseh's messianic hopes. Manasseh wrote a book about this narrative, The Hope of Israel. In it, Manasseh argued and tried to give learned support to the theory that the native inhabitants of America at the time of the European discovery were actually descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. The book was originally published in Latin, Mikvah Israel, hoc est spes Israelis, and Spanish, Esperanza de Israel, in 1650, but the publication in English in 1652 in London caused great controversy and polemics in England. Now, this theory is, 1652, way before Joseph Smith's theory about the Native Americans being lost tribes of Israel. And no doubt, somewhere along the lines, Joseph Smith actually read this book or information or knew it through his Freemasonry and had a cave experience just the same way that Muhammad did in his imagination, I'm guessing. Drury wrote in favor of a Hartlib Circle project for a College of Jewish Studies. Parliament was lobbied for funds. The proposed faculty were Johann Stephanus Ritangel, Christian Ravius, and Manasseh ben Israel. In 1649, Drury addressed a further inquiry into Manasseh on the subject of the 10 tribes, which resulted in publication of The Hope of Israel. In 1650 appeared Thomas Thorogood's Jews in America. Drury read in the manuscript and contributed to later editions. He included information on the Karaites, in whom he had particular interest from Ritangel. So, we think that Joseph Smith pulled this idea of the Israelites being in America from nowhere, from his angel Moroni, and yet, this whole concept was started way earlier by this particular Hartlib Circle. It says here, Drury is considered to have been one of those around Cromwell influencing the decision to allow Jews to enter England officially. They were expelled by Edward I. He was the cautious author of a pamphlet in 1656, A Case of Conscience, whether it be lawful to admit Jews to a Christian commonwealth. In it, he laid down certain conditions that Jews must fulfill in order to be admitted: no blasphemy or proselytism, etc. To a question put to him by Hartlib as to the general lawfulness of their administration, Drury replied in the affirmative, but from the point of view of expediency, he considered that circumstances as to a particular time and place might render their admission unwise. So this guy, Drury, has a really interesting philosophy on Christianity and Jews, and he has this connection to Amsterdam, and basically these Dutch East India merchant type people. The Manasseh ben Israel, who helped promote this idea of the lost tribes in America, his real name was Manuel Diaz Soiro, better known by his Hebrew name Manasseh or Manasseh ben Israel, was a Jewish scholar, rabbi, Kabbalist, writer, diplomat, printer, publisher, and founder of the first Hebrew printing press, named Emeth Meret Titsma in Amsterdam in 1626. So here we've got Amsterdam and the Netherlands again. Manasseh was born in La Rochelle in 1604 with the name Manuel Dias Sierra a year after his parents had left mainland Portugal because of the Inquisition. So they were Sephardi Jews. They were probably part of these Exilarch families. The family moved to the Netherlands in 1610. The Netherlands was in the middle of a process of religious revolt against Catholic Spanish rule throughout the 80 Years' War. So Amsterdam was an important center for Jewish life in Europe at this time. The family's arrival in 1610 was during the 12 Years' Truce, mediated by France and England at The Hague. In Amsterdam, he studied Moses Raphael de Aguilera, who was a Sephardi Dutch rabbi, Hebrew grammatician, and scholar who wrote more than 20 books on various topics. A commentary of biblical verse, a Hebrew grammar, books on Jewish law, treatises, Aristotelian logic, a classical Greek and Roman literature. Now, Robert Drury was the father of John Drury. And it says here about Robert Drury was a Scottish Presbyterian minister. He achieved notoriety for his Presbyterian principles, which brought him into conflict with James VI, who wished to impose an Episcopalian system. He attended the General Assembly of Aberdeen. So it says here that Drury was the second son of John Drury. He studied at St. Mary's College, St. Andrews, and visited La Rochelle while at St. Andrews. Now, why was he in La Rochelle? This is where Manasseh ben Israel was born, in La Rochelle. Again, why was he visiting there? What's the connection? A city on the west coast of France and seaport on the Bay of Biscay. While at St. Andrew, he and James Melville tutored Robert Bruce. He stayed with James Melville, whose wife was his sister, accompanied Melville to the Parliament of Linlithgow in December 1585 and to Berwick-on-Tweed in September. In 1586, he became subsequently assistant to the schoolmaster of Dunfermline and minister of Abercrombie Fife in 1588. So on his Britannia profile, Manasseh ben Israel, it says here Manasseh was born to a family of Maranao Jews of Spain and Portugal who publicly accepted Christianity but privately practiced Judaism. After his father appeared as a penitent in an auto de fe, the family escaped to Amsterdam, where Jewish settlement was officially authorized. Manasseh, a brilliant theological student, became the rabbi of a Portuguese Jewish congregation in Amsterdam in 1622. He founded the city's first Hebrew printing press in 1626, publishing his works in Hebrew, Latin, Spanish, and Portuguese. Among his writings, Conciliador, third volume, 1632 to 51, was an attempt to reconcile discordant passages in the Bible. It established his reputation as a scholar in the Jewish and Christian communities. Manasseh maintained friendships with Hugo Grotius and Rembrandt, corresponded with Queen Christina of Sweden, and was an early teacher of Benedict de Spinoza, who was Jewish. Manasseh believed that the Messiah would return to lead the Jews to the Holy Land only after their dispersal throughout the world was achieved. So this was contrary to Christianity, and if you don't believe that Jesus was born of the Holy Spirit, then as the New Testament says, you deny the Holy Spirit is the unforgivable sin. He considered immigration to Brazil in 1640 and reported the alleged discovery of South America of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. In Esperança de Israel, Hope of Israel, to support the settlement of Jews in Protestant England, where their presence had been officially banned since 1290, he dedicated the Latin edition of his work 1650 to the English Parliament. So, I mean, if there's not an agenda here, I don't know what else to say. That this Hartlib Circle associated with this person here who doesn't believe in Jesus Christ, but that a Jewish Messiah would come once the Jews were dispersed across the whole world. And this was the very beginning, the people that started the idea of the British Israelite movement. Manasseh continued to plead for the formal recognition of Jewish settlement in England, and he appeared before Oliver Cromwell in London in 1655 to argue his cause. While in England he wrote Vindicate Judaeorum in 1656, Vindication of the Jews, in answer to contemporary attacks on Jews, including William Priney's short demurrer. He returned to Holland in 1657, believing his mission to have been unsuccessful. His efforts, however, initiated the unofficial English acceptance of Jewish settlement and led to the granting of an official charter of protection to the Jews of England in 1664 after Manasseh's death. So the whole concept that Europeans, British, Germans, the Nordic people were the lost tribes of Israel. I'm not saying it's not historical, but the concept comes from this guy here, who was a Sephardic Jew, and from what I've shown, the Sephardic Jews of Spain, Portugal, and the specific region in France were brought to that region through the Exilarchs coming out of Babylon, who claim that they are descendants of the tribe of Judah. They are saying they are the descendants of King David himself. And this is where the whole concept that the royal families of England and Europe are related to the throne of David. Not only this, they are not a Torah-based Jew, as they are implying through the word Jew. What they are Talmudic and Kabbalistic occult Mystery Babylon believers from Babylon itself. So they are from the Exilarchs who come from Babylon and not from the Judeans. So through Hartlib and the Hartlib Circle, the first English people to start writing about the British being the lost tribes of Israel, the whole concept of this movement started from Manasseh ben Israel, who, mind you, was not a Christian, but was promoting what you can only read into this as an Exilarch Messiah. What the Chabad Lubavitch believe today, people like Rabbi Schneerson, who was an Exilarch, and Exilarch meaning the leader of the exiled out of Babylon, they believe that their Messiah is still yet to come. So Manasseh believed that the Messiah would return to lead the Jews to the Holy Land only after their dispersal throughout the world was achieved. And what does that mean? That means that in the First World War, the same people and the same groups of families were promoting through Benjamin Disraeli that the English people accept this notion that the Jewish people returned to the Holy Land and signed the Balfour Declaration, and the concept that Britain was aligned with them under this British Israelite movement, that the Jews and the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh would be united under this concept of establishing the Holy Land, what we know today as modern day Israel. This is where this idea started, from a Sephardi rabbi, probably related to the Exilarch lineage of Spain and France. So it says here that they, as in Hartlib's family, had at least 6 children. His family life is rather poorly documented. One useful source is the diary of Samuel Pepys, as Pepys was a close neighbour of Hartlib's family in Axe Yard in early 1660s and a friend of Hartlib's son Samuel Jr., a clerk in government service. Hartlib's daughter Mary married the physician and chemist Frederick Claude, or Claudius, referred to as Dr. Claudius in the diary. Another daughter, Anne, or Nan, married the merchant, so here we have more merchants, and preacher Johannes Rhode of Ulrich in 1660, despite her lack of a dowry. Samuel Pepys, a guest at the wedding, described it as an occasion of very great state, cost, and noble company. Always the realist, Pepys thought it an excellent match for Nan, a great fortune for her to light on, she having nothing in the world. Hartlib, having heard a good deal of this kind of gossip, indignantly denied that he had married off his daughter to gain a share of the Rhode fortune. But the marriage was certainly advantageous, since Rhode's father was a rich merchant, and because Rhode, as a prophet preacher in Cromwell's years, had foretold the coming of a king. Now, which king's this? Is this the Exilarch king? They're obviously not talking about the return of Jesus, the king. The coming of a king. I mean, we all knew, and they all knew in those days, that the prophecy of the coming of their king, who is Jesus. So therefore, this is a different king. And they appear to be pushing millennialism, or a 1,000-year reign or golden era, which would seem not something that was really part of the public conscience of the people of that time. So people weren't really looking for the 1,000-year reign at that time. It took these millennialists to push this agenda. This worked to his advantage after the return of Charles II. I think they're referring to an Exilarch king, like, for example, Rabbi Schneerson. Now, it's really interesting that this guy's last name is Rhode. When we go to his wiki page, Johannes Roth. So they're saying his name is Roth. I wonder if that's like as in Rothschild. I don't know, but he was the son of an Amsterdam patrician, Zacharias Roth, a sugar merchant. Hello, alarm bells, anyone? An administrator at the Dutch East India Company. And I'm just going to add this little article here. It's from the Business History Conference, Amsterdam's Sephardic Merchants and the Atlantic Sugar Trade in the 17th Century. And it says the paper presents a new synthesis to understanding the westward expansion of sugar production and trade in the 17th century Atlantic world by linking Amsterdam's expanding sugar market to the Sephardic Jewish merchant network. The Dutch 17th century Golden Age is often presented as the age of capitalism and speculation about the role of the Jewish merchants in the capitalist order, as expressed by Werner Sombart in The Jews of Modern Capitalism still abounds in some quarters. But so is Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic, considered a major contributing factor to the emergence of the capitalist state. The author will offer an analysis which ties Amsterdam as emerging stable market to the network of merchants of the Portuguese nation conducting trade from the Iberian Peninsula to Madeira, Sao Tome and Brazil to Antwerp in the 16th and Amsterdam in the 17th century, including trade with Barbados and other English colonies. By Portuguese nation, I refer to the emigres from the Portuguese Jewish communities who settled elsewhere under the pressure of anti-Semitism and the Catholic Inquisition, and that included both practicing Jews and conversos. Jews who had converted to Christianity due to the pressure that they faced but still retained elements of Jewish identity, family connections, and practices. Merchants from the Portuguese nation brought colonial wares, sugar, and tobacco to market in Amsterdam, which were processed and distributed throughout Europe, greatly enhancing the status of the city as a city of wealth and influence in the emerging early modern European world. Amsterdam, with its growing trade connections, welcomed Sephardic Jew merchants with their experience in long-distance trade and widespread international connections. They proved useful in financial services and diplomatic negotiations as well. As a result, the Sephardic Jewish networks operated under the aegis of Holland, pioneered the development of the international sugar trade in the 17th century and cemented Amsterdam's role as a Central European port. Now, Sephardic Jew is kind of important because I've stated before, there's a book by a man named Wexler, and he traces the Sephardic Jewish language back to the Arab people. So it's Arabic in origin. So the Sephardic Jewish people came from the Arabian nations, which really fits in with this Exilarch story now that I've learned about this, because the Exilarchs were from Babylon and they developed their power and trading routes in Babylon and in the subsequent empires of the Arabic nations. So the Umayyads, the Persian Empire, and so on. Here we have a book, The Development of the Sephardic Jewish Sugar Trade Network. By 1650, Brazil was the largest producer of sugar in the Atlantic and Caribbean region, and an offspring of the plantation slave system of sugar production introduced by the Portuguese on Madeira and Sao Tome. The Brazilian sugar production system developed swiftly during the early 17th century, when Amsterdam became the main center of sugar refining and distribution for the European market. From 1630 to 1654, which is exactly the time that these people like Rhodes were trading in England and in Amsterdam, northeast Brazil came under Dutch colonial rule, during which the Sephardic merchant community gained the most prominent position in the sugar trade, establishing a foothold in the Caribbean region when sugar production expanded to include French and English colonies. Dutch rule ended in 1654, at which time Sephardic merchants migrated to nearby emerging Caribbean sugar colonies to return to Amsterdam. Now, this all ties in with the African slave trading system as well, which, if anyone's awake to know that it was actually Jewish merchants who started this trade system. Okay, so this is, is it assassination via association? I don't know. It's funny how all of these people have these weird connections to Puritans, which are linked to Sabbatean Frankists, which are linked to Exilarch rabbis. His father sent him on foreign trips in preparation for merchant life, where he was introduced to the pietistic idea of Ludwig Friedrich Gefhiel, among others. Now, when I hear pietism, I can't help but think of Noahide laws. Pietism. Remember where pietism comes from. Pietism, also known as the pietistic Lutheranism, is a movement within Lutheranism that combines its emphasis on biblical doctrine with an emphasis of individual piety and holy Christian life. That's the official version. Remember the Moravian Church that's linked to pietism. Swedenborg was associated with the Federlane Society, was the first flowering of the Moravian Church in England, founded by the Count Nicholas Zinzendorf, a German religious and social reformer, bishop of the Moravian Church and major figure of the 18th century Protestantism. The Moravian Church, formerly named the Unitas Fraternum, Latin for Unity of the Brethren, was derived from the Hussite movement started by Jan Hus in early 15th century Bohemia, to which had belonged Bishop John Amos Comenius, a core member of the Hartlib Circle. Hello, Hartlib. Here we go. He's linked to Sabbatean Frankism and this Moravian Church. And here is the lamb of the Moravian Church with the St. George cross flag. It just reminds me of the lamb of the beast of the earth that has horns and speaks like a dragon. So also here we have in Catalonia, Spain, we have a region called Radonia. In trying to find where Rodon was for the Lord of Radonia came up, and Catalonia is a region that is in the same area of the Bay of Leon, where a lot of these Exilarch families settled. And a strange fact is that they have this lamb with the cross of St. George as their coat of arms. Huss was burned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 1415, despite the protection he had received from King Wenceslas the Fourth of Bohemia and his brother Sigmund, Holy Roman Emperor and founder of the Order of the Dragon. Like the Rosicrucians following the Protestant defeat at the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620, the Brethren were forced to operate underground and eventually dispersed across northern Europe as far as Low Countries, where communists attempted to direct a resurgence. After 1620, descendants of the Bohemian Brethren who stayed in Bohemia and Moravia, referred to the hidden seed which communists had prayed would preserve the evangelical faith, made up the core of a regrouping a century later under the influence in Zinzendorf. The refugee established a new village in Herrenhut, an upper Lusitanian town in the Görlitz district in Saxony, Germany. Zinzendorf was raised by a grandmother who corresponded with Leibniz in Latin, read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, and studied Syrian and Chaldean, and exposed him to themes of Jacob Boehme and Christian Kabbalism. This would bring Zinzendorf into contact with heterodox Jews whose sympathies for the teachings of Sabbatai Zevi. Now, Sabbatai Zevi was related to Sabbatean Frankists. Remember, Jacob Frank was an Exilarch, and the Exilarchs declaring that they are the lineage of David, which is the whole philosophy behind British Israelism, led them to a position close to Christian students of Kabbalah, seen by many pious. So here's the pious. So this fella here, Johannes Roth, was introduced to pietistic ideas by Ludwig Friedrich Gifthiel, among others. I wonder what others. So Zinzendorf was the pupil of and godson of the direct originator of Pietism, Philip Jacob Spener. Pietism was a movement within Lutheranism that began in the late 17th century, whose forerunners were Jacob Boehme and Johann Valentin André, the author of the Rosicrucian Manifestos. Spener was powerfully influenced by preaching of the converted Jesuit preacher Jean de Labadie. Originally a Jesuit priest, Labadie became a member of the Reformed Church in 1650 before founding the community which became known as 1669. Labadie was among those who had been kept informed of the progress of Sabbatai Zevi's mission by Peter Serrarius and spoke about Sabbatines in his sermon. Here we have with Johannes Roth ties to the Dutch East India Company, rich sugar merchants. I mean, alarm bells. We know who all these people were and belonged to the owners of the slaving ships that enslaved many African tribe people in our name and blamed us for it. So walking the Hague's Bosch in 1652, he received a calling as a prophet, stating, "God came to me like in a heavy tempest." During the First Anglo-Dutch War, he served as an itinerant preacher. Through sermons and writings, he sought contact with foreign leaders. In 1654, he was imprisoned in England by Oliver Cromwell, as his sermons were seen as a plea for the return of Charles II of England. After his release in 1658, he travelled to Denmark and Prussia before returning to England in 1660. At the time, Charles had been restored to the crown and rewarded his supporters, including Roth, who was elevated to peerage in London. He married Nan Hartlib, daughter of the celebrated scholar and intelligencer Samuel Hartlib, connected to Sabbatean Frankism. The diarist Samuel Pepys wrote an account of the wedding, which took place in Goring House and was described as a magnificent occasion. So Goring House marked the western edge of London in 1660, where Buckingham Palace now stands. Possibly the first house erected within the site was that of Sir William Blake. Pepper's somewhat cynical remark that Nan was lucky to marry a wealthy man, a great fortune she has lit upon, since her father was almost destitute. After returning to the Low Countries, Rhode continued writing pamphlets. He threatened senior people, especially the stadtholder, declaring that they should do penance. He announced the coming of Nebuchadnezzar II, a Chaldean king of Neo-Babylonian Empire. In the year 1672, the Dutch year of the disaster after the assassination of John de Witt, he foretold the end of the world, and with his supporters he moved north to fight the final battle against Satan. He arrived in Hamburg in 1677 with his followers, who quickly disbanded after the world's end failed to arrive. So because of another pamphlet aimed at William III of Orange, he was arrested in 1676 and imprisoned. Family connections led to his release. So he was highly connected. And this person here, John Sadler, was actually a lawyer. And we go back to Spellman, and we see that Spellman's ancestry and family were all court judges, sirs, knights, knighted, and in the legal industry. So I just want to go on a little bit more about Johannes Roth, de Roth of Rhode, Mr. Rhoda. So it's really interesting that this name comes up, that Roth, and Rhodus, it kind of sounds like roads. Here I have the legend of Makir of Narbonne. In the legend of Makir of Narbonne, a scion of the hereditary Jewish exilarchs of Babylonia named Makir and descended from King David, was sent to kingdom of the Franks at the request of the king. Makir himself made a member of the Frankish royal family and placed in charge of the Jewish community of Narbonne, maintaining parallel Jewish and Christian names and identities. His son William became a Christian saint after a heroic military career and a number of children. Because of Makir, those who could trace their ancestry to Frankish kings could also trace their ancestry through the Jewish exilarchs to King David, and from thence through the biblical narrative to Adam and Eve. So I just want to go into the meaning of the word Roth, and here we have a genealogy page of Roth, R-O-T-H-E, History, Family Crest, Coat of Arms. So the name comes from Old German word rot, meaning red, and could have indicated that its bearers had red hair or red beards. So I'm bringing up the Radonites, and I think this will be important with some of the information I've found here. The Radonites are, if you haven't seen my other videos, medieval Jewish merchants active in the trade between Christendom and the Muslim world during roughly the 8th to the 10th centuries. Many trade routes previously established under the Roman Empire continued to function during that period, largely through their efforts. Their trade work covered much of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of India and China. Several etymologies have been suggested for the word Radonite. Many scholars, including Barber de Maynard and Moshe Gill, believe it refers to a distinct Mesopotamian called the land of Radan in Arabic and Hebrew texts of the period. Another hypothesis suggests that the name might be derived from the city Ray or Ragas in northern Iran. Still others think the name possibly derives from Persian term Ra, way, path, and Dan, one who knows, meaning one who knows the way. Two Western Jewish historians, Cecil Roth, so his last name is Roth, Red, and Claude Cahen have suggested a connection to the name of the Rhone Valley in France, which is Rhodanus. In Latin, Rhodanos in Greek. They claim the center of Radonite activity was probably in France, as all of their trade routes began there. Well, I think it's all the above. I think their trade routes began there for a reason, and I think that it did start in the Middle East, in Iraq, And I think these Radonites were Exilarch merchants. As we know, if we look up the Exilarchs, they started as merchants from the exiled Jews from Judea in the Babylonian exile. And I just want to add here, just because they say that they're the lineage of King David does not make them righteous. The main foundation of the British Israelite movement is that the royal family of Britain and the royal families of Europe are related to the line of David. And I don't see how any Christian can see this as a good thing, because basically you're saying that Jesus is not necessary, because the only reason the line of David was chosen was for the Messiah to be born, which was Jesus. The line of David was terribly corrupt, and the line of David that went to Babylon were just as corrupt. And when you read Kings and all of the evil things that all of the kings of Israel did, in Acts we have, you have taken along the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Raphan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. Acts 7:43. So Radan was a region in south-central Mesopotamia or Iraq in the early Middle Ages. It was an administrative district under the Abbasids and also diocese of the Church of the East. It is also known to have a Jewish population and was probably the country of origin of the Radonite merchants. The name, however, does not appear in any Hebrew text. The exact location of Radan is not certain, but it was not far from Baghdad. It may have been roughly the same as the area known since the later Middle Ages as Suad, a fertile territory southeast of Baghdad on the eastern bank of the Tigris. Other authors place it in north of Baghdad, still east of the Tigris, or further south of Baghdad and west of the Tigris in the region of Mayshan. So in this The Times of Israel article, it says tradition traces the origins of the exilate to the exiled king Joachim of Judah and the Babylonian captivity, and thus would include the Davidic descendants enumerated in 1 Chronicles 3:17-24. However, the dignity is usually reckoned to have officially been instituted only in the Roman period, shortly after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132-135 AD. Babylonian word for river can also mean canal, and the accepted meaning of Cherba is the Grand Canal. Apparently, Jewish exile communities, including one called Tel Abib in Ezekiel 3:15, were situated near the canal. It seems likely that the Cherba of Ezekiel and the river Kabara from the Al Yehuda archive refer to the same thing. The documents in the archive detail business transactions among the communities that span among the entire length of time between the beginning of the Jewish exile in Babylonia through to the Persian kings who ruled after Babylon fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia. They even trace the business history of one Jewish family over 4 generations. The evidence these documents reveal is that at least some of the Jewish exile families prospered and even became wealthy while in captivity. The overall picture and the archive paints is that the Jews were not merely slaves passed into forced labor on projects in which they had no stake. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon's policy with populations he had forcibly displaced was more sophisticated. The archives show that the deportees were settled in abandoned or newly created towns in the countryside. There, the deportees worked to cultivate previously unused land, and in return for the taxes they would pay and the military service they would provide as part of their obligation to their new Babylonian ruler, they received land and the opportunity to make profit. So successful were many of the exiled families that some passed up the opportunity to return to their homeland when the 70 years of enforced exile had passed. Instead, many chose to stay in the only homes they had ever known and where they had become wealthy and comfortable. Decades later, during the reign of Persian King Xerxes I, called Ahasuerus in the Bible, it was said of the Jews that they had communities all across the Persian Empire. In Esther 3:8, which at the time stretched from Ethiopia all the way to the border of India. The origin of this Jewish diaspora is found in the Babylonian exile. There can be no question that a large-scale deportation of Jewish people took place during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, nor can there be any doubt the Jewish communities lived for generations in new communities throughout Babylonia. The Al-Yaduda archive provides strong archaeological support for the biblical account. So, like we have these Jewish communities set up in these towns outside of Babylon, farming towns, and becoming wealthy. Not all of them. Some of them returned back to Judea, but some of them became very wealthy and they became merchants. Radonites primarily carried commodities that combined small bulk and high demand, including spices, perfume, jewelry, and silk. They also described as transporting oils, incense, steel, weapons, fur, and slaves. Now, when we look at Rhone, is a major river in France and Switzerland, rising in the Alps and following west and south through Lake Geneva and southeast France before discharging into the Mediterranean Sea or the Gulf of Lion. At Erlies, near its mouth, the river divides into the Great Rhone and the Little Rhone. The resulting delta forms the Tomarjou region. The name Rhone continues the Latin Rhodanus name in Greek Roman geography. The Gaulish name of the river was Rhodonos or Rotonos. But when we break it down to Rhoda, we know that Rhoda is a female given name originating in both Greek and Latin. Its primary meaning is Rhodes, but it can also mean from Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, the Greek island originally named for its roses. The name was mostly used in the 18th and 19th century, but Rhoda is mentioned once in the Bible in the Acts. So Rhoda means rose. Rhode means red, rose-colored. Rhode is a combining form used to like a prefix meaning rose or rose-colored, i.e. pink or red. Connected the name of the Greek island of Rhodes, whose ancient harbour was home of the wondrous bronze statue, the Colossus of Rhodes, to the Greek Rhodon or rose. So we have rhodonite, which is a mineral, and it's a pink stone. And Petra, which is this merchant city, considered Arabian, the Nabateans who took over the civilization of the Edomites or the Idumeans. And Petra is known as the Rose City. Petra is also called the Rose City because of the color of the sandstone from which it is carved. So did these Radonites get their name from being merchants of the Rose or Rhoda city? And we've got Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. We've got Rhode Island in America. But another point here is if these Radonites were exilarchs or descendants of King David from Babylon, and they became wealthy and powerful merchants while they were there, we have 1 Samuel 16:12, and it says, "So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." So if we go to the full chapter, the prophet Samuel talking to Jesse, who was the father of David, and they were talking about King David when he was brought in. So here, then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from the day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. So King David was ruddy, which means red. Admoni or Admoni, ruddy, reddish, reddish. So I'm wondering if these exilarchs in Babylon and Persia looked red or ruddy to the native Persians, who would have maybe have been a different look. So that this is how they distinguish the Radonites or the merchants of the Exilarchs was that they were ruddy and red. So this is just like the Tudor family. Every reigning Tudor monarch had red hair. Henry VIII, his son, both his daughters, even several of the Brandons spawn since Henry VIII's sister Mary had carrot red hair. The only Tudor monarch who did not have it was Henry VII, who had dark hair. His daughter Margaret inherited his hair. So the Tudors, who are Plantagenets, who go back to this Rhone River area of France, all had ruddy or red hair. And their symbol was a red and white rose. So the union of the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of the House of York. Or was that the other way around? But either way, Lancaster and York, one had a white rose, one had a red rose.
I'd like to speak for a minute today about one of the most fascinating and little understood aspects of the commercial life of Jews in the Rhone River, and that is this interesting group known as the Radonites. Now, we don't know very much about them, but they are recorded in the accounts of several Arab geographers, such as Ibn Khaldun. I hope I pronounced that correctly. In the 9th century, he describes these Jewish travelers that he calls in one place the Radonites, others will call them the Radania, but the people who, and the name, by the way, is variously interpreted, but scholarly consensus seems to say that the term Radonites comes from the Rhone River, which was called in Latin Rhodanus, hence the Radonites coming from the river Rhodanus. And this Jewish group of travelers, according to these Arab geographers, spanned the globe with their commerce, all the way from Western Europe, across North Africa, across the Middle East, way into Eastern Europe, Russia, and so on, Central Asia, and then making their way all the way over even to India and China, well before Marco Polo and others made it there. We do know that they were Jews. What we don't know is how were they organized? Were they like a specific Jewish family? Was it some kind of Jewish trade guild? Hard to say, but nevertheless, the natural consequence of having a far-flung diaspora of Jews with Jewish communities located all over these trade routes made it really much easier for Jews to travel, especially easier than Christians who might not find it so comfortable to travel in Muslim areas or Muslims in Christian areas, and either group in Far Eastern areas unless they had kind of like advanced outposts, which of course the Radonites did because there were Jewish communities even along the Silk Road at this time. Ibn Khaldun mentions that they were multilingual, speaking, he lists specifically Arabic, Persian, Greek, Frankish, which is probably Old French, Spanish, and Slavonic. And of course, they would have to have known several other languages just to get along. What did they sell? Well, they brought from the east things like musk, aloe, camphor, cinnamon. This is the early spice trade, after all. From the west, they brought beaver and marten, manufactured goods like swords. And although by 21st century sensibilities, it's difficult to mention this, but in fact, they were slave traders as well. Slavery, very unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which became hugely industrialized, where slaves were treated as like disposable commodities that could be easily replaced with, and then such, kind of heavy losses could be incurred across the horrific transatlantic passage. That wasn't the same kind of slavery that we're dealing with here, which was primarily more like a high luxury good, because affording slaves at this time in particular would have been reserved only for the very wealthy. At any rate, they were involved in all kinds of trade, slavery being one of those. Now, by the way, if you poke around in some of the weird places in the web, which I certainly do not recommend, you'll see all kinds of strange conspiracy theories associated with the Radonites. There is nothing specifically nefarious or Babylonian associated with the Radonites, other than the fact that they traveled through Babylon and places like that, even to Khazaria for their various trade deals. But these were just extremely successful merchants. I hope you found this short video useful.
Of course, this gentleman here doesn't want to connect any conspiracies to the Radonites being from Babylon, even though there is a whole lot of historical evidence that the Exilarchs from Judea were actually the main merchants on the Euphrates River, and they became very powerful banking merchants, traders, tax collectors in the Babylonian Empire. So it's an obvious conclusion that the Radonites who came from Babylon were actually these people and originated with these people. Now, do I think every single Jewish person on earth knows this or is part of this conspiracy? No, I do not. I think they are mostly ignorant, like the rest of us, to what's going on. What I do think is that this particular group of exilarchs who have become very powerful, wealthy merchants, who I believe were the Nabateans who took over the Edomite kingdom, as it says in Malachi, the kingdom of Esau, or the inheritance of Esau, was left for the dragons of the wilderness. And these Radonite traders and merchants were definitely dragons of the wilderness. They could navigate these harsh environments on their trading routes, and they knew how to do that. The dragon being of the Nabu, the pet of Nabu, the god of Babylon, and the dragon in Revelation is red. Now, I have also said that it represents the Herod family, and obviously in Revelation 12 it does. The dragon represents the Herod family. But what I've recently discovered also is that King Herod's historian claimed that King Herod was actually a descendant of this Exilarch line of David or Babylonian Jews, and that was the claim. Josephus refuted that claim and said that it was contrived to make Herod more agreeable to a Judean population. However, we know that Herod's father was an Edomite and his mother was a Nabatean, and I think that this Nabatean city, which was a major trading city to these silk and spice road travelers and merchants, up until an earthquake destroyed the water source in Petra, I believe that this city was taken over and settled by these merchants. In Revelation 18, we have the merchants weeping as they stand back and watch the whore of Babylon burn. And I have some theories on that scripture that potentially not everyone would agree with me on that, but I actually think that whore was Jerusalem when she burnt. And the reason I believe that is because it says she is not a widow and she doesn't mourn. And the bridegroom was Jesus. The bride was Israel, and the bride murdered her groom, and Jesus was killed. So she didn't mourn Jesus. She wasn't a widow. She didn't mourn the loss of her king. But nevertheless, in that scripture, these merchants stand back and wail, and they're watching this city burn, and all of the trading routes of the day had to go through Jerusalem, and that's why King David and King Solomon were so rich. That's why King Solomon received 666 talents of gold from the king of Tyre. It was a trading deal. Jerusalem was a very lucrative position for trading and tariffs and taxing of those merchants traveling through those areas. And this is why the Edomites conspired with the Babylonians in the first place to attack the southern kingdom of Israel at the time, because they wanted to take those trading routes from the Israelites. The Roman Catholic Church did this really well. They put tariffs and taxes on a lot of market cities, so they were the main benefactors of trade. And they're still doing that in the background through private companies that own a lot of our road tolls and taxes, where the Vatican actually profits from that. And I think this is actually connected to this old Babylonian Talmudic temple system. I think the Catholic Church is linked to them somehow, but that's for another video. So this paper, Eleanor Barrackett, Radonites in Norman Roth, Medieval Jewish Civilization and Encyclopedia. It's on academia, and it's really bad copy. It's very blurry, but I'm just going to read here. It says Radonites, I can't read it because it's blurred. Overseer of the Mail and Information Service of the Abbasid Kingdom in the mid-19th century, wrote in this Kitab al-Maslik wal Mamalik, Book of Routes and Kingdoms, a section on Jewish merchants Radonites, who from the time of his writing about them have remained something of an enigma. Numerous scholars have attempted to explain the passage and to connect it either with the particular group or geographical location, and there is yet a difference of opinions. The first who edited this work, de Maynard, suggested that their origin was from the Suwad region in Iraq, and I think that all these people are right. But none of the scholars subsequent to him agreed with this. Hayard suggests that in 1879 that these were merchants from the West. I mean, why do they need to be specific to one place? I mean, we know the way these bankers work. I mean, look at the Rothschilds. They set a sun up in each powerful city. And they didn't necessarily have a headquarters. I think they've started in Iraq and they've moved through these very rich kingdoms and cities. In the same year, de Goege edited the work from the Muslim geographer Ibn al-Faqih, written in 902, in which he also mentions the Radonites, but from Rodania, and de Goege explained the name as reference to Doth merchants, a word of Persian origin. As already other linguistic scholars had explained, e.g. Dozy. Schipper in 1907 and Goodman in the same year returned to the theory of the western origin of the merchants. Simonson suggests that the name derived from the Rhone River in France, from whence the merchants supposedly came. Two scholars, Jacobs in 1919 and Katz in 1937, restored the origin of the merchants to the east, the province of Ragus in Media, an important commercial centre. So as I'm saying, we know these Exilarchs were merchants. We know they were Jewish. We know the Radonites were merchants, Jewish. They're from Radan in Iraq. As I'm pointing out here, the whole concept of red and the rose. In my other video, I've shown that King Herod had a rose on his sarcophagus. And now we know that the Exilarch were brought to France by the king. I think it was Charlemagne or King Pepin. Maybe Charlemagne's father or grandfather, I can't remember. And we have the Maquia set up in Narbonne in the Rhone River Valley in France. So Narbonne or Narbonne, I don't know how it's pronounced, but Narbonne, which is kind of interesting too because it's Nabo, Narbonne, Narbonne, Nabo. Which ties in with Nabu, Nabu, Nabutia, the god Nabu. A lot of synchronicities here. Is a commune in southern France in the Occitan region. It lies 849 kilometers from Paris in the Aude department, of which it is a sub-prefecture. It is located about 15 kilometers from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and was historically a prosperous port. So it's in the port, it's in the Lyon, the Bay of Lyon. The source of the town's original name of Narbo is lost to antiquity. I don't think it is lost. I think I've just solved the problem. Lab, Narbo, Nabu, Nabutia, Narbo. So we have Nabu. Jewish Babylonian Aramaic is the Babylonian patron god of literacy and rational arts, scribes, and wisdom. He is associated with the celestial planet Mercury in Babylonian astronomy. And Nabu rides a dragon. Here's Nabu on his little dragons here. So we have the association with red and King David. And we have the great red dragon of Revelation 12. So under the Arabs, for 40 years from 719 to 759, Narbonne was part of the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyad governor al-Shamar captured Narbonne from the kingdom of the Visigoths. So under the Carolingians, the Carolingian Pepin the Short conquered Narbonne from the Arabs in 759, after which it became part of the Carolingian Viscounty of Narbonne. He invited the prominent Jews from the Caliphate of Baghdad to settle in Narbonne and establish a major Jewish learning center for the Western Europe. So we've got these Exilarch merchants coming from the, they cross over very well between the Arab Islamists to the so-called Christian Western Europe. Let's not forget that it's likely Muhammad was part of the Exilarchs. Muhammad, meaning blessed one, and potentially a lineage of Exilarchs who started the Islamic religion. And Muhammad's wife, who was a Roman Catholic nun and a very rich merchant's daughter from Petra. We go to the Fanda Films YouTube page and they will show you how the Qibla all pointed to Petra before a certain time period, which is around 700, which is around the time that this is all happening in France. And these Arabic Umayyad empires were ruling this Narbonne region. The Exilarch were very much involved in the early Islamic creation. So the Kaaba stone being originally located in Petra before they moved it to Saudi Arabia, when, as I said, Petra became non-viable due to the fact that an earthquake ruined the water source. So I think that this surname Rhodes comes from merchants from this area, and we see this guy Roth from Amsterdam. His father was a very rich sugar merchant. I mean, we need to just connect these dots here because these people were also migratory, so they weren't necessarily Dutch or had always been in Holland. They may have just moved there because of this prosperity of the Dutch East India Company in Holland, which then later became the British East India. I mean, they're all connected. I mean, they tell us there were wars between the two, and maybe there were, but you know, these people had no allegiance except to their group and their religion. As I said before, do I think all Jews are in on this? No, I do not. I think this is a merchant elite that has aligned itself with the kings of the earth, which is exactly what the Bible tells us. It tells us that there's the merchants and the kings of the earth, and they're all getting rich off this merchant system. They're all getting rich of all the fine things that are being traded in Jerusalem. The whore, that's who I think it is, being burnt because they're throwing dust on their heads. This system is being destroyed for that time and for that season. So basically, we have these two groups, and they are an aristocracy. They're not everybody. Not everybody knows what's going on here, and I think they hide behind these Ashkenazi Jewish people who are not Semitic, are actually Khazars from the tribe of Japheth, and they indoctrinated them on the Silk Road because they became like their police force. So they needed bigger numbers. They didn't have huge numbers. Being a minute elite group from Babylon, they did not have huge numbers, and so they had to indoctrinate other people to do their dirty work. So they included the Ashkenazis into their system, and they benefit and bonus from that system. But did they know everything? No, they were ruled by this minority elite. The same with today. We are ruled by a minority elite. Most people don't know what's going on. Even these Freemasons, who are basically the same, they're the Goyim that are indoctrinated to do their dirty work. And most people will do it just because they are getting notoriety, they're getting money and power and position. They don't know the huge extent of exactly what the agenda is. We do. We have the Bible. It tells us what the agenda is. The agenda is that these people want to inherit the earth. They want to take the blessing of Abraham, and we know that blessing went to Jesus. There's no other way of getting the blessing. It's not a fleshly blessing. We can't inherit it. Even if we claim that we are descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, we cannot take this blessing through the flesh. That's what Jesus said. It's all through the scripture of the New Testament. You cannot receive the inheritance unless you go via Jesus. Without him, we can do nothing. So that's what the whole prophecy and blessing to Abraham through Jacob was. It was about the birth of the seed of the woman, the Messiah. It had nothing to do with pride in the flesh or claiming any of these blessings or kingdom or covenant that God had through any effort of our own. It's spiritual, and if you don't understand the spiritual things, then you will never understand the new covenant that God has through Jesus to us. So I'm just looking at the ancestry of Cecil Rhodes. It goes as far back as James Rhodes of Snape Green, Whitmore, Staffordshire. This information is taken from the various pedigrees and genealogical notes among these and other Rhodes papers held in the library. The earliest traceable direct ancestor of Cecil Rhodes is James Rhodes of Snape Green, Whitmore, Staffordshire, husband of Christina. Now we also have a James Rhodes from around the same period, who was Sir James Rhodes, born in the 15th of December 1560 in Hipperholme, Yorkshire, England. His father, Sir Thomas de Rhodes, was 39, and his mother, Alice Morton, was 33. So Thomas Rhode, or Rhodes, goes back to Richard de Rhode. The name seems to keep changing because husband of Joanna de Rhodes, but with an RH, but he is Rode. So this de Rhode family has a pretty ancient heritage. So Williamus de Rhode, and they go back to Normandy in France. So Pierre de Rhode. So that's as far as it goes back to Sir Pierre de Rhode. Viscount Berenger de Rhodes II. Birthplace Villa de Rhodes, France. So right near Toulouse in France, between Spain and France and this Gulf of Lyon, right where all these particular families come from, and not far from Lyon in France. And I believe there's a Lyon not too far down here in Spain as well, where a lot of Exilarch families established themselves in both of these cities, and named after the line, potentially the line of David. Known as Berenger de Rhodes, Viscount Berenger de Rhodes II, Sir Pierre de Rhodes de Rodez. Berenger was born in 1020 in Rhodes, Pyrenees Orientalis in France. His father, Richard II de Rhodes, was 18, and his mother, Rixinde de Narbonne, was 15. So Rixinde Narbonne was the sister of Raymond Narbonne. Do you know Narbonne? Now I can't point any kind of relationship between this Rhodes family and the Exilarch, but I mean, here's the legend of the Exilarchs. It says, the legend of Makir first appears in the Sefer HaKabbalah, the book of tradition written by Abraham ibn Daud, Abraham ben David, about 1161. It actually first appears as a gloss to one 14th or 15th century copy of a manuscript of the Sefer, which is most important textual source for the lineage of the Jewish Nessim of Narbonne. The chronicle contains a legend of the foundation of the line by Makir, a descendant of King David in the reign of Charlemagne. In the Sefer, Abraham asserted several things as traditions. Charlemagne asked Harun al-Rashid to send him a rabbi from the house of David, or in the older way of phrasing, King Charles Martel sent to the king of Baghdad Caliph, requesting that he dispatch one of his Jews of the seed of royalty of the house of David. In response, a scholar by the name of Rabbi Makir duly came to the west. Again, in an older phraseology, the Caliph heeded the request and sent Charles a magnate and sage, Rabbi Makir by name. After capturing Narbonne from the Saracens, Charlemagne granted Makir a third of the city. King Charles settled Makir in Narbonne, the capital city, and gave Makir great possessions at the time he captured it from Ishmaelites, Arabs. The king made Makir a nobleman and designed out of love for Makir good statutes for the benefit of all Jews dwelling in the city, as is written and sealed in Latin charter, and the seal of the king therein bears his name, Carolus, and it is in their possession at the present time. Merchant Jews from Iraq or Babylon, so would have been related to all of these descendants of the Makir who became merchants in Babylon. And so the merchants of the earth are actually people that declare themselves as the house of Judah, but they are cut off in illegitimate according to the New Testament. So that I don't give them any precedence or, say that they're anyone important. I just want people to realize that they think that they're important, and they claim all of these blessings of Abraham and that they have dominion over us and the earth. And basically, we are their merchandise. If anybody's watched Jordan Maxwell and the Law of the Sea and the different merchant laws that they claim our lives as their own property under all of their contrived laws that mean nothing really, but we all seem to follow them because most people have the mark of the beast in their forehead and in their hand. Says the chronicler claimed that a special privilege issued by King confirmed this grant of land and placed the Jewish community of Narbonne under royal protection. Makir took a wife, a woman from among the magnates of the town. Prince Makir became chieftain there, and his descendants were closely interrelated with the king and all his descendants. Makir founded an important Talmudic school in Narbonne. Now, I think this is really important to realize that Talmudic practices were happening way back around 700-800 in France, way before the Knights Templars were formed, and it was closely associated with these descendants of Charlemagne and the Carolingian kings. So I think that these kings and knights were already practicing Kabbalah and Baphomet worship way before they went to Jerusalem, as the story goes, in the Crusades, and found mysterious things under the temple and started to worship Baphomet. I mean, that's the traditional story of the Knights Templar and how it originated, but I think that the Knights Templar were actually established way before that, and the whole purpose of the Crusades was to claim the Holy Land for these particular Talmudic schools. Whatever the place and origin of the text, it may be reasonably assumed to reflect a local Jewish belief in the foundation legend by the 13th century or later, and there is no reason to doubt the succession of Nessim in the 11th to 13th centuries as encapsulated in it. So Taylor notes that the legend of Sefer allows one to reconstruct the pedigree of the Jewish leader of Narbonne, purportedly Makir's descendants, beginning with one Tudors in the later 11th century and extending through the beginning of the 14th century. Now, what does this mean? Because that was kind of a Freudian slip. Tudors, House of Tudor. And we have this red and white rose here, the rose of Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. Also, it's kind of interesting that Rhode Island in America, we have Rhode Island in Jamestown, the original colony, English colony in the United States. And it was John Sadler, 1605, who was related to John Sadler, political theorist, reformer, Hebrew scholar, millenarian, and Cambridge Platonist, a friend of Milton and Samuel Hartlib, who ended up in Jamestown. So John Sadler was brother-in-law of John Harvard, founder of Harvard College, and his sister married Richard Quinney, whose brother was married to William Shakespeare's daughter Judith. I mean, like 6 degrees of separation. I know that we cannot have any solid foundational links here, but why are all these people related and studying these particular major historical places in our history? Now, I'm not going to really go into it here because it will get too long, but I mean, there's the alternate theory on who William Shakespeare actually was, and that he was not a real man, but he was the pen name of perhaps Francis Bacon or a man named Christopher Marlowe. It says in this article here, unsurprisingly, the main candidates proposed as the true authors of Shakespeare's works are men with far greater status and education credentials than Shakespeare. The three most compelling candidates are Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, Francis Bacon, a philosopher and statesman, and Christopher Marlowe, a playwright and poet. Those who advocate for Edward de Vere highlight his connection to the Tudor court as well as his own literary career. De Vere's life also echoes some plot points in Shakespeare's plays, such as travel, military campaigns, and his marriage to the Cecil family. Hello, the Cecil family will come up later in the push for British Israelism in later years. That would give him an insight into political intrigue at court. Now, it's interesting because I'm bringing up the Rhodes family, and we have Cecil Rhodes, and maybe it's an intermarriage between the Rhodes and the Cecil family. But Francis Bacon also is said to be the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth I, who was a Tudor. And I've shown that the Tudors or Plantagenets go back to this particular region in France also and are linked to Exilarch families. So this is where the royal families of England get the notion that they are related to the throne of David. So there's literally no meaning for Tudors online. It just keeps going to, hang on, Tudors. What's this one say? Why were they called the Tudors? Why are the Tudors called the Tudors? As Lauren Mackay explains, the royal dynasty began with a scandalous secret marriage between Owain ap Maredudd ap Tudor, or royal attendant of King Henry V's widow Catherine of Ballios. Says the Tudors were originally from Wales, but they were not exactly of royal stock. The dynasty began with a rather scandalous secret marriage between a royal attendant named Owain ap Maredudd ap Tudor, Tudur, and the Dowager Queen Catherine of Ballios, widow of King Henry V. So I don't know, like, is this Tudor name a misspelling of a name from the Exilarch family lineage, Tudors? Taylor notes that the legend in the Sefer allows one to reconstruct a pedigree of the Jewish leader of Narbonne, purportedly Makir's descendants, beginning with one Tudors in the later 11th century and extending through the beginning of the 14th century. Unfortunately, Taylor adds no source to fill the gaps between the legendary 8th century foundation or affirmation of Narbonne's royal Jewish dynasty and the later 11th century when the Sefer HaKabbalah text supports a continuous pedigree. We cannot now determine the validity of Davidic origins of the Jewish dynasty of Narbonne, or even its continuity or the names of the individual Nassim before the 11th century. Well, of course we can't, and we don't need to, because their lineage doesn't matter. But what does matter is that this story keeps going around and around, and that they seem to believe that they have the divine right of kings to rule us and own us. So here we have King James I, King James of the King James Bible, The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. So if we understand that these kings, for example, these Plantagenet kings like King James here, are related to Exilarchs, we can understand why they have this arrogance and this belief that they have divine right to own the earth and own us also who are on the earth. There are many different agendas, I think, from these minority aristocracy going on in the Roman Catholic Church and Protestantism, and I can't quite figure out why they had the split in the division. Maybe they were trying to initiate Noahide rules through piety and purity. As of my last video, we know that Freemasonry was promoting Noahide as early as the 1700s. It wasn't really the time for them at that point. Nevertheless, I think we can see and start to form out of all of this information this dragon elite that comes together in our time through banking, politics, and religion. Maybe they wanted us at this time to have the religion of the Bible because it convinced us that somehow this line of David was important, or that we needed kings to rule over us. So they needed the New Testament because it was something they had to control in the early 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, because Christianity was growing and gave people power of individuality. But they had to control that narrative and take everybody back under this temple system where we had to pay taxes and tithes and sacrifice wealth for our sins. I mean, the tables that Jesus overturned in the temple were owned by one of the priestly families who were profiting from merchandise in the temple. Other accounts in the 12th century report that the Mackay family enjoyed for centuries many privileges and that its members bore the title of Nasi, Prince. Benjamin of Tudela, who visited Narbonne in 1165, speaks of the exalted position occupied by the descendants of Mackay, and the royal letters of 1364 also recorded the existence of Rex Eudorium, which would be Judorium, at Narbonne. The place of residence of the Mackay family at Narbonne was designated in official documents as Cortada Regis Judorum. Mackay is said to have founded a Talmudic school there, which vied in greatness with those of Babylonia, which attracted pupils from many distant points. So Arthur Zuckerman maintains that Mackay was actually identical with Natroni ben Habibi, an Exilarch deposed and exiled in dispute between two branches of the family of Bostonii in the late 8th century. So remember, one lineage of Bostonii was considered unclean because they were half Persian. Zuckerman further proposed that Mackay Natroni is identified with the Magario Count of Narbonne, and in turn with a Mary de Narbonne, whom heroic poetry marries to Elda or Eldana, daughter of Charles Martel, and makes father of William of Geloni. So this William was subject of at least 6 major epic poems composed before the era of the Crusades, including Willem by Wolfram von Eschbach, the most famous of the medieval Grail chroniclers. So see how closely associated this is with the Grail. The Grail coming from Nabatea, so the Grail being the womb of the Holy Mother. His historical counterpart, William I, Count of Toulouse, led Frankish forces at the fall of Barcelona in 803. Zuckerman notes that Count William was son of Frankish Count of Septimania named Theodoric, leading him to conclude that Theodoric was none other than Mackay, and that the well-documented descendants of Theodoric embodied a dynasty of Franco-Judaic kings of Narbonne, representing a union of the lineage of the Exilarchs with that of Martel's Carolingians. So it's so interesting that we have this Rhodes family in England, the royal or an aristocratic family of Rhodes that links all the way back to Narbonne in France, the Rhone River Valley, and we have Rhodes of Africa. So no connection to Rhodes of Africa that we can show, but I mean the lineage just cuts off and starts from nowhere with no parents. So I mean the fact that Cecil Rhodes gave his entire fortune to the Rothschild family and was linked to Benjamin Disraeli and the establishment of the modern nation of Israel with the Balfour Declaration. And we have this guy here, Johannes Rhodes, who is linked to the beginning of the British Israelite movement, and he's linked to all of these pious movement people who go back to, again, Sabbatean Frankists. Is this a coincidence? I mean, synchronicities are kind of mind-boggling. All right, what does Rhode Island mean? Some attribute the name to Dutch explorer Adrian Block, who called it Rhode Island, meaning Red Island, again because the red clay is similar to the Greek island of Rhodes. It says the first official reference to the island by the English is in these words: Aquaneck shall be henceforth called the Isle of Rods or Rhode Island. The earliest recorded English colonist text by Roger Williams refers to it as Island of Rhodes. The name Colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations was adopted in the Royal Charter granted by King Charles I of England in 1633. So I've kind of found something interesting here. And we have a Walter Rhodes, 1577 to 1653. And he was born in Kipperholm, West Yorkshire, England. And he died in the Providence of Rhode Island in the United States. Because we have his son Zachariah Rhodes, 1603 to 1665, who was born in Leamington Hastings Rugby Parish, Warwickshire, England, and he died in Pawtucket, Providence, colony of Rhode Island, the Providence Plantations, drowning off Pawtucket's Rhode Island. So how ironic is this? We have this Rhodes family living on Rhode Island around this time that, here it says 1633 by King Charles I, who's related to all these groups of people I'm just talking about. And we have this Zachariah Rhodes of Pawtucket, who is living on Rhode Island, and his last name is Rhodes. But not only that, I'm going to go back in his history. Walter Rhodes is of the Rhode nobility of England. And if this particular line of the Rhode family, so Richard, is from Chester or Cheshire in England. And when we go to Cecil John Rhodes, it says, although Cecil Rhodes' family may be traced back to Staffordshire and Cheshire in the 17th and early 18th century. So as I've shown, like Cecil Rhodes' ancestry online comes to an abrupt stop to an ancestor, John Rhodes. And it says that I have found that they were merchants in the past, but it just stops there, and that's where they started. I'm guessing that if this particular nobility of Rhodes family were found in Cheshire, and then we have a reasonably wealthy merchant family of the Rhodes family starting in the same area, there's a good chance that they are one of the lineages of this nobility Rhodes family. So if I follow this nobility line back, Sir Richard de Rhode, so John de Rhode, and Yorkshire, England, William de Rhode. So the name changes up slightly. They keep using the spelling with a H or the spelling without a H, R-O-D-E. So Thomas de Rhode, so Robert de Rhode, Sir Hugh de Rhode, and we get to Sir Williamus de Rhode, 1040 to 1110 in Normandy, France. And we'll follow their line back by the father. It goes back as Berenger de Rhodes, Viscount Berenger de Rhodes, the second Sir Pierre de Rhodes. Yeah, that's as far as I can go with that line. Here we have Sir Pierre de Rhodes, Rhodes, R-O-D-E-S. It's another version of the spelling. Villa de Rhodes in France, and this was that same lineage that came from the Rhodes royal lineage. There's when Berenger de Rhodes was born in 1020 in Rhodes, Pyrenees Orientalis. In France, his father Richard de Rhodes was 18 and his mother Rixinde de Narbonne was 15. So same family lineage. So I'm going to guess that's about as close online I'm going to get to Cecil Rhodes being related to the nobility Rhodes family of England, which is a link I got from this Rhodes family genealogy history blog, trying to connect the Rhodes family nobility to the Cheshire family of Cecil Rhodes. Notice how their heraldry has a standing lion, and all of the House of David families had heraldry with lions on them. There's a comment here from Scott Rhodes, and he says that I was able to find that Balfour estate that Sir Francis Rhodes built in the 1500s is still standing and is now a private school. I also found some interesting info. Francis Rhodes had a son named Sir John Rhodes, who had a son named John Rhodes, no more Sir. Turns out that John Rhodes was disinherited by his father, Sir John Rhodes, and subsequently the Rhodes Baron line ended due to the estate being split amongst Sir John Rhodes' daughters. The John Rhodes who was disinherited ended up dying in Virginia, US. Okay, so I found Frank Rhodes, British Army officer. Colonel Francis William Rhodes was a British military officer. He is perhaps best known member of the Rhodes family after his mining magnate brother Cecil. So he is definitely Cecil Rhodes' brother. Now I found him on this Jenny web page. If we go back, he's the son of Reverend Francis William Rhodes. Now Reverend Francis William Rhodes was the son of William Rhodes, and William Rhodes was the son of Samuel Rhodes, and Samuel Rhodes was the son of Thomas Rhodes. Thomas Rhodes was the brother of William Rhodes and the son of James Rhodes, and James Rhodes was born in Staffordshire of England. However, his son William was born in Cheshire. So they're linked way back here in 1664 to Cheshire in England. So their ancestry is pretty closely linked to the nobility Rhodes family in the same region around the same time. Are they related? As I said, they're not going to show me on a Jenny page, but there's a lot of Rhodes who are related to this noble family, and they're linked to Rhodes in United States and going back to Rhodes in France. So, what's the odds of this Rhodes family showing up around the time that the island, well, it's not really an island, but Rhode Island was named, and this family owned a great deal of land in this area. It says William Arnold with Zachariah Rhode, William Harris, and Robert Coles for their shares were allotted a large tract of Pawtucket where they once made settlement. It was a beautiful meadowland about 4 miles southerly from Providence, bounded on the east by Narragansett Bay and on the south by Pawtucket River. So they owned a fair amount of land in this region. And they were related to nobility of England, and I'm guessing they're also related to Cecil Rhodes, who gave his inheritance to the Rothschild family and promoted British Israelism. Okay, so I know I've gone into a long genealogy of all these people who started the British Israelite movement, but I think it's really important that we see their connections and family connections, political and religious connections to these certain groups and how it began, because I'm probably going to do about 3 videos on this, and later on we see how Cecil Rhodes comes into the story of the British Israelite movement via Zionism and convincing the British people and the Western people of the Commonwealth and America that this Zionist agenda to establish the nation of Israel is one that's akin to their own heritage and history, and that it's something that should be done or is politically okay to do. It was very much the same as a call for crusades back when the Roman Catholic Church and the Pierre Leone family called for all of these knights, these French knights from this specific region that I've just been talking about, to crusade and take the Holy Land, which they did. They got the Kingdom of Jerusalem for a very short period. So thanks for watching, and hopefully in the next video it'll be more clear as to how this agenda has been manipulated to convince Christians of a Zionist agenda.